Hi all you sake lovers out there, and welcome to Sake Science, the series where I try to decipher what's really going on inside your sake bottle. And for my very first episode, I've decided to focus on the one compound that's probably had the most impact on the aroma and flavor profile of sake over the past 30 years, and has also helped make sake more popular with a whole new group of consumers. And the name of that compound is ethyl caproate. So let's start with the basics. What is ethyl caproate? Well, it's part of a class of compounds called esters that contribute to the pleasant aromas of many fruits, flowers, and other fermented beverages like wine, beer, and cider. In sake, esters are produced mainly by the yeast, and it's done through the condensation of an alcohol with a carboxylic acid. In the case of ethyl caproate, the alcohol is ethanol, and the carboxylic acid is a fatty acid called caproic acid. Ethyl caproate contributes to the aromas of apples, pineapples, and strawberries, among other fruits, and it's even present in milk. Caproic acid is actually a significant component of goat milk and helps give it its kind of distinctive goaty aroma. In fact, the name caproate is derived from the Latin word for goat, capre. And there's another name for ethyl caproate, which is ethyl hexanoate, with hex standing for the 6 carbons of the fatty acid chain. And in Japanese, it's known as kaporon-san echiru. So don't be confused about the various names, just recognize that they all refer to exactly the same thing. What's interesting is that until the 1990s, the predominant ester in sake was a different ester called isoamyl acetate, which contributes to the aromas of bananas and pears. We can see just how much the aroma profile of sake has changed in recent years by comparing the odor activity values of the two esters, isoamyl acetate and ethyl caproate. The odor activity value gives us kind of a measurement of how intense the aroma is to our nose, and anything over a value of 1 is detectable. Comparing the values between 2005 and 2015, we can see that isoamyl acetate, or IA, stayed basically the same, whereas ethyl caproate, or EC, almost doubled. And I'm not just cherry-picking data here. This is a real trend that, if anything, has intensified in recent years. So what made this possible? Well, in the 1980s, scientists developed a way to isolate high ethyl caproate producing yeast by using an antifungal antibiotic called cereulinin, which is produced by a pathogenic rice fungus. And we're going to get a little bit into even more science here, but it's kind of important for understanding the characteristics of this high ethyl caproate sake, so kind of bear with me. You see, when yeast is happily growing and fermenting, it uses glucose as an ultimate source of the building blocks with which it creates these long chains of fatty acids of 16 and 18 carbons especially. And then it modifies these fatty acids to create various membranes in the cell. But cereulinin blocks the process by which these fatty acids are formed, and therefore the yeast is unable to grow and thrive. Yeast that are resistant to cereulinin have a natural or engineered mutation that makes them able to survive despite having a defective fatty acid synthesis pathway. This makes them able to survive the treatment of cereulinin and also leads to the creation of many more medium chain fatty acids, especially of 6 and 8 carbons, but also of 4 and 10. These acids exist as a precursor bound to another molecule called CoA. And that's where another enzyme steps in, transfers ethanol to the fatty acid, and creates the ester. Now, it's not known exactly why yeast make these esters, but there are a couple of theories. One is that it's part of a general detoxification system in the cell. And another is that the esters somehow help stabilize the cell membrane. Whatever the reason, the result is we end up with a sake with a mix of volatile fatty acid esters that produce a mix of fruity aromas. So now let's take a look at a sake that's made with this high ethyl caproate producing yeast. This is a product made by Kameizumi in Kochi, and it's even available overseas, and it's pretty well known as one of these high ethyl caproate containing sakes. I think it leaves a strong impression on people who try it, and it's notable for having its specs prominently displayed on the front label. But I wonder how many people who drink this really understand the significance of these specs. And so I want to go through them together with you. First, we have the name of the yeast, which is CEL-24. The CEL stands for cerulenin. CEL-19 and CEL-24 are probably the most well-known yeasts that were produced using cerulenin in the early 1990s by researchers in Kochi. It actually took until 1998 for Kameizumi to bring a sake using CEL-24 to market. And that's because it doesn't have very high fermentation power. But it was eventually found that supplementation with thiamine, or vitamin B1, could help increase its fermentation ability. Now, not all high ethyl caproate producing yeast go by this CEL nomenclature, and so you will find them with various names. Next we have the ABV, which is 14%. And this is a genshu, and typically a genshu will be anywhere between 17 to as high as 21% alcohol, so this is notably lower. There are a couple of reasons for this, but one of them has to do with the fact that these high ethyl caproate producing yeast, remember, are not able to produce those long chains of fatty acids to make strong cell walls. And it's been found that the integrity of the cell wall is really important for a yeast's alcohol tolerance. Next we have the SMV, or sake meter value, which indicates the amount of glucose and other sugars left in the sake. And I've seen other bottlings of this where this is even more negative, but this is still a very sweet -11. There's a reason for this as well. Remember, yeast uses glucose as an ultimate source for the building blocks by which it builds those long chains of fatty acids. And so the more glucose you feed a high ethyl caproate producing yeast, the more ethyl caproate it will actually produce. Not all sake made with high ethyl caproate producing yeast is sweet, but generally the sweeter the sake, the higher the amount of ethyl caproate that's present. Moving on, we have the acidity, and again, I've seen this be as high as 2, but for this bottling, it's still above average at 1.7. And again, there's a reason for this. One is that CEL-24 actually has another mutation that makes it produce more of the apple-like malic acid. And since organic acids are also ultimately produced from glucose, again, the more glucose that you feed this yeast, paradoxically, the more acidity it will also produce. And finally, there's the amino acid level. This is a pretty low, 0.8. And from this, I'm assuming that they're using a koji that has a high amount of glucoamylase and low amounts of protease and peptidase, so that we are producing a lot of glucose for the yeast to make that high ethyl caproate level, and not as much amino acids, which can lead to other flavors and aromas that can kind of cloud the clarity of the ethyl caproate. And the overall result is, well, I'm drinking this out of a special glass that was designed by my sensei at Infinite Sake School, and this glass is designed to really enhance the aroma of ethyl caproate, and it really works. And yeah, you can get that very clear apple-like, kind of pineapple-like aroma. And it's very clean, very clear. I'm not getting a lot of like fusel alcohol or anything in that. Mm. Ooh, yeah. Um, Quite a bit of punch of acidity there, and it's, it's sweet, but the acidity really balances it out. Um, Again, just very apple-like, very fruit-like, that kind of very juicy aromatic sake that's very popular these days. And so, in thinking about how to drink this sake with food, we can think about where that kind of sweet and tart, apple like profile can really enhance the food. And one thing you want to think about is that you don't want to use foods that have too much of their own aroma and flavor that will kind of clash with that clean ethyl caproate aroma. So one of the go-tos is kind of fresh cheese, and also you can use things like sweets, especially uh, sweets that have fruit and whipped cream. Another thing you can think of are things like salads that can especially go well with a sweet and tart dressing. And if your family was like mine and always had applesauce with pork, then you can even try this with, for example, a roast pork or even pork chops. So before we wrap things up here, I just want to bring up some issues with sake made with high ethyl caproate producing yeast, and also clear up some misperceptions about the storage and handling of these sake. The first issue for brewers especially comes from the fact that the enzyme that produces ethyl caproate from that precursor can also hydrolyze it into ethanol and that free caproic acid. And if we remember, caproic acid smells like, yes, goat milk. So inevitably, the more ethyl caproate we make, the more caproic acid is also made. And how much of that you're willing to tolerate is kind of a matter of personal taste. The second problem is due to the physical properties of ethyl caproate. You see, ethyl caproate is not very soluble in water and only slightly more soluble in a water ethanol mixture like sake. And so the majority of ethyl caproate produced while brewing is actually lost to adhesion to the lees and also to filter materials, especially if those are synthetic. On the other hand, we're not going to lose a lot of ethyl caproate to evaporation or to reactions with oxygen. We can see that the boiling point of ethyl caproate is well above that of water, and also its vapor pressure is very, very low. So we wouldn't expect that things like warming to 45 to 50 degrees Celsius or pasteurization to 65 degrees Celsius are going to affect the amounts of ethyl caproate very much. And in fact, I just warmed up a high ethyl caproate containing sake last night, and it was amazing warmed and had a very strong apple aroma left in it. So just warming it up, you're not going to lose all of that ethyl caproate. Ethyl caproate is relatively stable to atmospheric oxygen under normal conditions, and it's even used as a flavoring agent in processed foods, which you wouldn't be able to do if it reacted with oxygen so easily. But there is one reaction that's very important for the amounts of ethyl caproate in sake over a long period of time, and that's the reaction with water. You see, acidic conditions can catalyze the reaction of water and ethyl caproate to form ethanol and the free fatty acid. But normally this uses a very strong acid, and it also progresses very slowly under normal conditions. In addition, it's reversible. However, there's so much water present in sake to begin with that the equilibrium is inevitably pushed towards these bottom products. For an idea of just how quickly this happens, we can take a look at data from sake stored in the 100-year sake storage project done by the National Research Institute of Brewing. They measured the odor activity values of various aromatic compounds after 10 years of storage at ambient temperature. In the beginning, the average odor activity value for ethyl caproate in the 28 sake that they studied was about 17. And after 10 years, that had gone down to 11. But remember, any odor activity value over 1 means that it is detectable. So there's still, after 10 years of storage at ambient temperature, a significant amount of ethyl caproate left. However, other compounds with strong odor also increased with storage. Things like sotalone, methional, and DMTS. So in some cases, it might not be that ethyl caproate is disappearing over time so much as being masked by these other strong smelling compounds. So you don't really have to worry about your sake losing ethyl caproate over the short term, but if you're really concerned about it, then by all means, refrigeration is a way to slow that hydrolysis reaction down. And it's always a good way to keep your sake in the state in which you bought it, especially if it was Nama. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting and that it answered some of the questions you might have about ethyl caproate. And if you liked it, please smash that like button. Anyway, keep an eye out for my next sake science video, and until then, keep exploring sake.